Good afternoon and warmly welcome to this webinar on productivity and productivity commissions. My name is Daniel Lind and I work as a research director at a trade union-related think tank called Arenagruppen. And in that position, I'm responsible for a 3-year project on productivity financed by the 5 unions within Swedish industry. Our guest today is Professor Andrew Sharp. He's the founder and editor of the journal International Productivity Monitor, and he's also the founder and director of the Research Institute Center for the Study of Living Standards in Ottawa, Canada. Andrew, we are very pleased having you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
The setup for this webinar is very, very simple. There's first a presentation by Mr. Sharp for half an hour or so. Then will be a discussion among the two of us, and then we open up for questions from the viewers. So please state short and sharp questions on our Facebook, and we will bring them up later on. All in all, we have 60 minutes at our disposal. And having said this, Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. It's really a pleasure to see you for the first time. We've been in touch many times, and to make a presentation today to your group. The International Productivity Monitor, as you mentioned, which is the journal that I founded and edit, has a strong relationship with Sweden, and one of our founding members was from the union movement in Sweden, Roland Spant. And I recall being at your office in 2014, where I gave a presentation on productivity. It wasn't a discussion of a productivity commission at the time, but it was a discussion of the productivity issues. So it's kind of coming home again remotely. So what I have today is a PowerPoint presentation on the overview of productivity issues. And I basically have divided it into 6 parts. I first want to talk very quickly about Swedish productivity performance, so you know where you are, and I think you're actually doing surprisingly well. Then I'll talk about why productivity is important, and then how productivity is measured, the determinants of productivity growth, and then key issues in the productivity area and developments, and finally agendas for productivity commission. So there's a lot of material there, and I'll have to go fairly quickly. Okay, now, first off, Swedish productivity performance. Actually, I was surprised by how well Sweden is doing. There's 2 kind of metrics for productivity. One is the level of productivity, which is, as you'll see, determinant of your overall standard of living, and then the growth rate. Now, so I'm looking at the 36 OECD countries, and the most recent year, 2022, and at that time, the level of output per hour, not per worker, per hour, in Sweden was $74 US. That's measured in terms of purchasing power parity in 2015. And that means that Sweden ranked 7th of 36 OECD countries. And it was literally identical to the productivity level of the United States, which is considered the world technological center. Now, Sweden was exceeded by 2 of your neighbors slightly, Denmark, very slightly, and then Norway a little bit more. We'll talk about that later, maybe. And then there were other 4 countries that exceeded Sweden: Ireland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Belgium, European countries. This basically shows you in terms of the levels here. Now, so that's, and the key point is that the countries that did exceed Sweden, most of them did so by a very small amount. Now, Ireland is the top country, but again, we have to discount Ireland because of measurement issues. Basically, a large number of multinationals book their profits in Ireland, and that results in a very high GDP. So it's kind of an outlier, really. Luxembourg also is an outlier because many people work in Ireland and live in other countries, and there's financial markets there that also affect GDP. So again, Luxembourg, a small country, is an outlier. Even Norway is an outlier in the sense that it has a lot of oil wealth, and that really boosts GDP. So, excluding those 3 outliers, Sweden is really one of the top countries in terms of its productivity level currently. Okay, now that's in terms of the next variable is the growth rate. And as I mentioned here, Sweden basically grew at 1.36 6% per year. That's total economy output per hour. And that was 17th out of 36 countries. So that doesn't sound as impressive, really. 17th, that's in the middle of the pack. However, it really is impressive in many ways, and as I'll mention. First off, it exceeded that of the United States. Again, we're looking at a very long period here of 22 years. Productivity is really a longer-term concept. You really have to abstract away from a business cycle to get the long, and that's why we're looking at a 22 period. So basically, so it exceeded the United States slightly by about 1 percentage point, which is positive. And then the 5 countries that did better than 5 of the 6 countries at higher productivity levels in Sweden in 2022 had lower productivity growth rates. Now, the exception was Ireland, and I said Ireland is a complete outlier because of the multinationals and the booking of profits there. So those other countries that I mentioned, really, they had lower productivity growth rates. And first off, now, why is basically Sweden in the middle of the pack? And I'm saying that's not bad because there's this concept of technological convergence. That means it's much easier for countries with low productivity levels to experience stronger productivity growth than countries with high productivity levels because they can catch up and use the latest technologies. And the majority of the 16 countries that enjoyed stronger productivity growth than Sweden since 2000 were either Eastern European countries or past underdeveloped countries like Korea or some of the Latin American countries like Chile. And therefore, it's in a sense, it's basically a normal that Sweden would have lower productivity growth than these countries. I'll just put up the slide that has the growth rates here of the countries. You'll see Sweden is in the middle there. And then at the top, you have Latvia, Ireland, Lithuania, Korea, Turkey, Slovak Republic, Poland, Estonia, Costa Rica. Those are countries that had low levels of productivity in the initial period and therefore benefit from technological catch-up. So in that sense, Sweden really basically it did 2 things well. It had high productivity levels, 7th, and then it basically did better than the countries that had higher productivity levels than it, except for Ireland. So that's overall a fairly positive performance. And it exceeded that of the United States, which in many ways is the leading country for technology. Okay. Why is productivity important? Well, productivity is the only long-term sustainable way to improve standard of living. And I'm defining standard of living here very narrowly in terms of GDP or income per capita. Now, of course, GDP per capita is affected by other factors such as the employment rate, the number of hours one works, but there's the limits to how many hours you can work in a day and a week, a year. And also there's limits to the number of people that can be employed. Now there's often potential to improve the employment rate. Again, you strike limits there where there's no limit. Productivity is not upward bounded. Another factor that can affect living standards is the terms of trade, which is defined as the ratio of the price of exports to imports. So if the export prices of a country go up and the import prices don't, it basically, its real income goes up because it's getting more money for the goods it's exporting. And therefore, even though productivity might be unchanged, incomes can increase. The problem with terms of trade is that they are basically very volatile and they seldom exhibit a long-term trend. I think Switzerland is the only country that's had a long-term increase in its terms of trade. Other countries, there's no real trend. So you really can't count on the improved terms of trade to boost your real incomes, whereas you can count on productivity to boost your incomes. Now, there's a very strong empirical relationship between productivity growth rates and levels and GDP per capita. I'll just give you 2 slides that illustrate this. Basically, this one here shows you the relationship between growth in GDP per capita and growth in productivity. Productivity is the bottom axis, and the GDP per capita is the top axis. And you'll see that the top very right, we have these countries that have a very, very rapid growth in productivity: Lithuania, Latvia, Ireland. And then at the same time had very rapid growth rates in real income. the correlation coefficient is literally 0.9. You see that almost all countries are on that line there, including Sweden, which is obviously a little lower because it had lower growth rates of these two variables. Now, that same relationship applies to the levels. Here we see that at the bottom we have the level of productivity, and then on the y-axis we have the GDP per capita. Again, the correlation, the coefficient is literally 0.9, and we see at the top that Ireland has the highest level of labor productivity and also highest GDP per capita. Luxembourg not. So there's basically almost a one-to-one relationship between these variables. Okay, let's turn to how productivity is measured. And okay, now productivity is the relationship between inputs and outputs. So that's the basically relationship. Now, the most widely used measure of productivity is labor productivity, and that's defined as real output or GDP per either per person employed or per hour worked. We prefer to use per hour worked because hours per annual hours can change over time, and it's more so it's a more accurate indicator of labor input than works, because many that's the standard measure. Now, for productivity levels, basically, there's two kinds of productivity levels. You can define productivity in terms of current dollars, current prices, and that captures the relative price effect. So if the price of oil goes up, then a country that produces oil will have a higher current dollar output per worker. So its productivity growth rates has happened, even though in real terms, it's not increased its productivity. Now, when we're talking about productivity growth rates, we're always talking about constant prices or as proxies for real physical changes in productivity. When we talk about productivity growth, we're not talking about changes in the value of output, we're talking about physical outputs, or at least a proxy for physical outputs. So this can create a lot of confusion often, but I'm saying, but basically we always want to deflate take into account inflation when we're calculating productivity growth rates. Now, another concept of productivity is total factor or multi-factor productivity. And this is really an index of output to an index of inputs, where the inputs are capital, labor, intermediate goods, and cost shares are used to weight the growth rate of those inputs to construct a total input index. This concept is used by extensively by academic economists and in government as well. It's more problematic because it's harder to get good measures often of the capital stock. But in principle, it captures increases in output that are not explained by increases in labor or increases in capital services or intermediate goods. And it's supposedly a measure of disembodied technological change, but it really affects many factors such as capitalization, economies of scale, measurement issues. It's really a residual, or as it's been called, a measure of our ignorance. Now, in terms of productivity measurement, so the challenges, productivity measurements are basically challenges are associated with measuring real output and inputs, hours work, capital stock. So basically, all the problems of a statistical system come together in terms of producing productivity, because it's at the apex of the statistical system, because you have to have good measures of outputs and inputs to have good measures of productivity. But the greatest challenge is in measuring real output that's a greater problem than measuring capital stock or hours worked in particular. Now, there's two problems in measuring real output over time for an economy. The first problem is the measurement of real output in the non-market sector where prices do not exist. And if prices do not exist, therefore you cannot deflate the nominal value of output to obtain a measure of real output independent of the inputs. So therefore, what do you have to do in the public sector? Well, you have to use inputs. That's your measure of output. And the main input is labor, so you have number of hours worked. And therefore, if hours worked increase, then output increases. And by definition, productivity is zero. So there's a lot of measurement problems in the non-market sector. For that reason, many economists focus on the business sector for their analysis of productivity. But the OECD, for example, uses the total economy. US, they focus more on the business sector. That can create problems in measurement. which I can get into later or talk about if you want later. So therefore, now there's been a massive literature on how you measure output in the public sector in terms of taking into account quality and in getting measures of output that are not just based on labor input, they're based on some product that the public sector produces. And it's possible to do that, and I could talk more about that later if you're interested. And Sweden has actually done a lot of work in that area. Now, the second problem is even more challenging than the non-market sector productivity measures. It's how do we measure new and improved goods? How do we incorporate the prices of new and improved goods into price indexes? Because if we don't have a proper price index that really reflects quality, then our measure of real output will be biased. And many people feel that we're basically not accounting for adequately the quality changes in the products we have, or the new product. Like, how do you factor in a smartphone into a price index for telecom? A smartphone has very different characteristics than your traditional phone. So, of course, but this has always been a problem over time. We've always had new goods, and we may not ever have done it very well, and we may be completely underestimating our real income. Some people argue that. So this is a really big area. We can talk about it later if you want to go into the details of how we're addressing it. But it's important to know that. Now, all these problems don't mean we should just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, productivity numbers are useless. They're still very useful, but we have to be aware of their limitations. Okay, now I want to turn to the determinants of productivity growth. Okay, a very, very quick overview here. Now, I think in the long run, what really matters for productivity is technology. That's really the key driver in the long run. Now, of course, it's associated closely with technology is capital accumulation, or increases in capital per worker. And because many innovations are embodied in new capital equipment. So you have to have investment if you're going to basically take advantage of new technologies. A third key driver of productivity is, if you want, human capital, the skills, numeracy, and technical skills of the workforce. If you want to realize the potential productivity gains from technological advance, you basically have to have people that can use that new equipment and new technology. And then another factor that influences productivity is the discovery and development of natural resources. They can have a major impact on productivity levels. And we see that in Norway. The discovery of oil in Norway was a major, major boost to that country's level of productivity. We see that in Canada, where we have, for example, Newfoundland and Labrador, offshore oil was discovered there. All of a sudden, it went from basically the lowest income in the country, lowest productivity, to literally the highest of all the provinces. We see that in our jurisdiction of the Northwest Territories, where they discovered diamond mines. And diamond mines has very high value added per hour worked, and it went up to being the highest, the jurisdiction with the highest productivity level. Okay, so those are kind of the three, and there's a methodology called growth accounting, which basically tries to quantify all these different factors. Now, in addition to these, if you want, basic or proximate drivers of productivity, there's many indirect factors that influence productivity. The obvious one is the business environment. And that includes the regulatory regimes related to trade, investment, competition, taxes, the fiscal situation. They also affect business decisions, because outside the government sector, it's the private sector, the business decisions that are driving productivity. In a sense, it's the businesses that are responsible for their productivity. They obviously always have a vested interest in improving productivity. In addition to the business environment, it's the overall quality of a governance of a country that's closely related to its productivity performance. Obviously, bad governance can have disastrous effects for the productivity performance in a country. And then a third, if you want, indirect factor affecting productivity, which is a little bit more controversial, but I think there's still something in it, is natural cultures. The attitudes towards education, work, the state involvement in the economy, corruption, and risk-taking. All these factors can influence productivity performance. For example, look at what's happened to, say, Korea versus Nigeria. In 1960, Korea actually had lower GDP per capita than Nigeria. Since then, South Korea has joined the developed countries of the world, whereas Nigeria has done much worse. So what factor is it there? Is it it's hard to say. Nigeria had the oil wealth, it didn't use it. Korea did not have natural resources, it invested in human capital, in technology, and has done very well. So there's, one can argue that, for example, the Asian tigers have done very well because there's cultural factors in there. That's, I wouldn't say there's a consensus in economics on the importance of culture, but it certainly appears to play a role in explaining differences in international performance. Okay, now, what have been some of the key productivity developments and issues in recent years? Well, there's so many here. I'll just go very name a few. First off, there's been productivity researchers have really focused on productivity slowdowns, saying, why did we have a period of rapid productivity growth and all of a sudden there was slowdown? And the first slowdown took place around 1973 compared to the 45-73 period. And there was a large literature at that time on explaining that slowdown. And then since 2000, there's been also a slowdown in many countries. Now, there's no real consensus on the reasons for that. There's all sorts of potential culprits. My view is that it's largely the underlying pace of technological change. During after 73, the key fundamental drivers of technological change, if you want, the general purpose technologies, which had boosted productivity growth in the immediate post-war period, were kind of eroding and phasing out. And then so therefore we had slower productivity growth. Now, one might think that the IT revolution would also be a general purpose technology that would boost productivity. And we actually did see a pickup in productivity in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the United States, linked to ICT. But since then, since 2000 or 2005 in the US, productivity has fallen off again. Despite what we argue are fantastic technological changes going on, it doesn't seem to show up in the productivity statistics. Anyway, there's a lot of debate about that, but that's my take. It's largely technological factors. Now, there's been one key area of research has been looking at the firm level. In the past, we've looked at productivity at the national level and the sector level. And the last few decades, there's been a lot more use of firm data. Databases that have been produced. The OECD has been using a lot of this, and they, for example, using their firm level data, they actually show that the slowdown in productivity since 2000 is basically the top 1% of firms are doing just fine. Their productivity growth is fine. It's the bottom 99% of firms that have basically experienced lower productivity growth. And they argue that this reflects a failure of the diffusion of new technologies to these latter firms. That could be true, but that hypothesis has generated a lot of research in the productivity community. Now, okay, basically, now some of the other productivity issues, I'll just maybe go through a few of them here. Obviously, linked to the technology is artificial intelligence. Many people think that's going to have a massive effect, negative effect on employment, positive effect on productivity. I'm more skeptical because, sure, you can obviously identify many tasks that can be done by artificial intelligence, but then you'll have other tasks that will come up, just like the overall, we've seen massive growth in the service sector, new jobs that we didn't even consider 30 years ago, web designer that didn't exist. So new tasks can emerge from new technology. So, but certainly that's a key issue. Another key issue is industrial policy and its links with productivity. We see in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is supporting new industrial policy. Many economists think that might have a negative effect on productivity. Others are more sanguine, if you want, but that's a key issue for research. And then that, of course, is linked to the whole goal of net zero emissions by 2025. And that's an important topic for what are there trade-offs of that? Will we have lower productivity growth because of our measures to reduce emissions? That's the research on that topic is really in its initial stages. There's many other issues that we could talk about here. I'll just mention a few. Obviously, the impact of the pandemic on productivity, and a key factor in the pandemic was the increased use of remote work. Well, is remote work going to be positive or negative for productivity growth? We have different results on that. We don't really know yet. There's no consensus at all on the research there. Also, another area is the whole question of well-being and productivity. Okay, we improve our productivity. Does that mean we're going to be better off in terms of economic? There's many other factors that affect the well-being of a society other than GDP per capita, economic security, equality, sustainability. So how does productivity relate to those factors? And can you actually have negative trade-offs where if you improve productivity, you do worse on some of those other factors? That's a big area for research. Linked to that, of course, is the whole effect on inequality on productivity. Do we really need massive differentials between the pay of CEOs and the workers? In North America in particular, those ratios have just gone up massively in recent years. Is that really needed to incent CEOs? Many people argue that that's not the case. A big issue in Canada right now is the impact of immigration on productivity. We have a lot of students coming, foreign students coming to Canada, many of them working here, a lot of temporary workers. We're also taking in 500,000 people a year in terms of permanent residents. That's a very large increase for a country of 40 million people. And is that going to have a negative short-term, long-term effect? That's a big issue going forward. Okay, now turning now to the latter part of the presentation, basically the agenda for productivity commissions. As you know, the European Commission in 2016 recommended that the EU members develop productivity commissions, and many of them have. I think there's 16 so far. And I want to bring to your attention a recent article published by Dirk Pilat in the spring issue of the International Productivity Monitor, where he looks at the rise of these pro-productivity institutions and he reviews their developments. It's a very comprehensive article where he goes over the research studies that have been done by these institutions and tells so I recommend it strongly. It's really a key article for work in this area. Now, in terms of what these productivity commissions can do, actually, I have a lot of experience in this area because Canada created what was called the Canadian Labour Market and Productivity Centre back in 1985. That was a long time ago. It originally came from the Ministry of Finance, where they were concerned about productivity and wanted to improve that. But at that time, the unions had much more political clout in Canada than they do now. Unionization is down in Canada. So the unions basically convinced the government to look to have if you want, a bipartite or tripartite organization, largely based on the Swedish model, where we'd have both labor market and productivity issues looked at the same time. And they created this institution called the Labor Market and Productivity Center. And then I was hired as the director of research of that, and I'd been in the Ministry of Finance at the time. So that unfortunately was downsized in 1995, and then it went under. It was closed down in 2006 because business decided they just weren't getting out of it what they wanted. So we've had this experience of a productivity center or commission in Canada, bipartite, bringing together the, but I don't think it was really a success. And there's now an effort in Canada to develop a new productivity commission, but the government has not bought on that. Right now, we seem to have more problems in other areas. Productivity is not really top of mind of the federal government in Canada. So I'm saying, I've been involved with these commissions for many years. So I'll just go through some of the key roles that a commission can play. There's many, many roles that can play. And this is one, of course, is to conduct studies or references at the request of government on a wide range of topics that go beyond productivity. This has become the role of the Australian and New Brunswick and New Zealand productivity commissions. The government gives them a reference to look at healthcare or some issue that's tangentially related to productivity, but not directly on productivity. So that another area that I think is really important, you don't see a lot, is benchmarking productivity performance at the industry level to make comparisons with other industries in the country and to similar industries in other countries to identify what industries are doing well and which are doing poorly in the country, and the possible reasons for this. Now, when you've identified which industries are doing poorly, you can say, well, is that due to their lack of use of best practice techniques? Is it due to regulation? What is the cause? And that way, you can kind of identify what the problems are in the country. So I'm a big fan of benchmarking. It takes a lot of resources to do that. McKinsey has done a lot of work in that area. They're well known for that. So now other areas that productivity commissions can do is they can basically work directly with firms. You're almost a consultancy. The Japan Productivity Center does this, and they have experts in various managerial technologies or whatever, and they basically work with firms. So it's not quite clear how that one differs from management consulting, but you could basically subsidize firms that have problems paying for advice. Other key areas is to basically identify public policies that can improve productivity performance and develop particular programs to address those areas. Also, a productivity commission can have a strong research function to identify, again, the importance of the different drivers of productivity. And also, a productivity commission can have a public education role. Many people feel productivity has bad connotations. It means that you have to work harder or you're going to lose your job, and that's not all true, really. So a public education can be a key role for a productivity commission. And then, of course, is the basic role of detailed monitoring and analysis of productivity developments. So there's lots of potential roles that a productivity commission can play. And of course, in the Pilat article, he basically talks about the different what paths forward the different EU productivity commissions have taken. Now, in terms of in terms of the article, in terms of the topics that a productivity commission can work on, well, basically, Pilat details the areas that the 11 productivity commissions he looks at have done, and of course these are these are basically the direct drivers of productivity, including investment, human capital and skills, R&D and digitization, and of course entrepreneurship and business dynamics. And he details the studies that have been done by these productivity commissions in these areas. So there's lots of potential work for a Swedish productivity commission. It's just that you'll have to get together and decide what you feel are the priorities and what basically is the key productivity problems facing the Swedish economy. Unfortunately, I see I've gone over a little bit. I apologize for going over, but I think I'll end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for this very highly informative presentation, Professor Sharp. I have a lot of questions, but to start with, we have from one viewer had the question about the Swedish performance, and we have this big financial crisis, 2008 and 2009. Many countries has performed poorly after the financial crisis. Do you agree on that position that we have seen a slowdown not only from 2000 but after the financial crisis?
Well, I must admit, I'm not really an expert on Swedish productivity performance, and I really have not analyzed Sweden's productivity performance. All I did was take the data from the OECD, and I focus on, as I mentioned, the long term. I think it's the long run concept. From that perspective, Sweden has done well. Now, maybe it's done worse since the financial crisis than other countries. When you calculate productivity growth rates, the choice of the beginning and end period are crucial for your growth rate. So if I had used, let's say, 2008, it might not be as good. You'll have to go and calculate that from the OECD productivity database. My impression is no. I think basically Sweden has, even since the financial crisis, has done as well or better than many of its peers, not Eastern European countries. I mean the Western European countries. But I can't give you an answer for that. Because I don't really know the data enough about Sweden.
That's my opinion too. I just finished a paper on that in one of the Swedish journals. But anyway, when it comes to measurements, you discuss this on terms of trade and new measurement challenges. You talked about the public sector, but what about the growth of the private service sector in the measurement problem and the global value?
That's less of a problem because at least there we have prices.
Yeah, okay.
So if you have prices and you have the sales or revenues of a firm, well, then you can supposedly get a measure of the real output, real sales of that firm. So therefore, now there are prices. The key issue, there's still many issues there, whether you're really capturing the real output. Let's take the high-tech sector.
Yeah.
Okay, there's all these free goods associated with, let's say, the use of a smartphone, for example, or let's say the use of certain apps like Facebook. So many people argue that there's now a provision of free goods associated with high-tech firms, and we're not accounting for the, if you want, GDP or the income associated with these free goods. And if you ask people, well, how much would you pay to basically not have Zoom or not have certain types of technologies like Facebook or Instagram or whatever the app is? And they argue, well, it's kind of, we almost should be adding that to GDP. A recent study said that basically all these free goods associated with technology were worth 10% of GDP. So if that's the case, then maybe we're underestimating our true growth rate and therefore our productivity growth. I'm skeptical about that because people can say, well, I'd pay so much for this, but they might not really pay for it. More importantly, though, I'm very skeptical of it because we've always had this phenomenon throughout recent history. We had goods in the past that there was a lot of consumer surplus associated with them. People would pay. Robert Gordon, who always gives the example of indoor plumbing, he says that was greatly valued in the 19th century. People would, but they didn't have to pay that much for it, but they would have paid more. So therefore, you're really underestimating the real output because they would pay a lot. They would, if they didn't have to, but they would have paid a lot for having that over going outdoors. The example from the 50s is television. It was a new product and it was free. And therefore, people would have paid for that. And we see now they're actually paying for that with cable TV, streaming services, and so on. So throughout history, there's always been goods that have given significant consumer surplus to people, but we haven't captured that. So maybe it's just the same now. There's new apps that we have in abundance are maybe improving our quality of life, but are making life easier in certain ways, but we're not really adding to our, it's always been that way, and it would be misleading if we added that to GDP. So yeah, there's problems in the private services, particularly with these free goods issues, but I don't think but at least we have the market output. So we can measure the real output of a private sector firm with its prices.
Okay, thank you. You also mentioned this problem with diffusion, the bigger gap between the high productive and the low productive firms.
Right.
Do you connect this pattern with the globalization and global value chains?
I don't really, the whole, this is the argument that's made by those that say that the top 1% of firms are moving away in terms of their productivity level from the bottom 99%. That may be true. I don't quite understand it because right now, there's so much information out there. Firms should be able to identify the best practice techniques for their industry and use them. What is the barrier to firms identifying? Lack of resources, a lack of skills, and that could be. So I'm skeptical on that, but I do agree that the diffusion of best practice techniques across countries to the lower is the key for productivity growth, even in rich countries, because there's always industries where you're not world class. No country, even the United States, is world class in all industries. So you always can learn from the best practice or on the frontier industries throughout the world. So we should be promoting that. Now, whether the slowdown in productivity growth is due to a slower pace of diffusion, I'm skeptical. I think if we're gonna explain our slower pace of productivity growth, it's in the underlying technological change that's slower, not that the diffusion is slower. But from a policy perspective, I think diffusion is really important. And if you can identify market failures in the diffusion of best practice techniques, particularly to small firms who maybe don't have the resources to identify them, then I think I've always thought that was an excellent way for government to intervene and to improve productivity of the private sector.
But do you have any ideas or any policy proposals how to improve this diffusion process?
Well, in Canada, we have a program called IRAP. It's Institutes for Research on Applied Technologies. And we basically have consultants employed by the federal government, our National Research Commission Council, which is actually a research body. They're experts in technology, and then small firms can basically apply to them to get technical assistance and funding to adapt new technologies. And the evaluations of that program have shown that it's very effective. Firms obviously appreciate it. It's a free good for firms, and it helps them to adopt the best technologies. The United States, the classic example from the 19th century was agricultural agents, people that worked for the Department of Agriculture who basically went out and showed farmers what were the best seeds, what were the best technologies. They helped the farmers to develop the best practice techniques. And so it's the same principle. So now I don't know if Sweden has an agency like the IRAP in Canada, but IRAP program in Canada is always pointed to as an example of an effective program that promotes the diffusion of best practice techniques. So there's you could argue, well, that's the role of consultants. Why can't a private sector firm just hire a management agency firm, a management consultancy to identify what they should be doing? And of course, that happens all the time. So in that sense, it's not always clear that there's a major market failure there. Some people argue there is, some people argue there isn't.
Okay, perfect. One question, more question about the measurement of productivity, because with more firms being part of production processes in global value change, how do you think about not measuring productivity in terms of sector, but in terms of production processes, using input-output techniques to see the combination of different inputs from different sectors?
Right. Well, I know that you're an expert in that area. We published an article by you on that, and I'm all for that. I will note, first off, it seems to be now there's kind of a deglobalization movement, and global value chains may have peaked. They'll always be with us, but they're not growing at the pace that they were in recent years. That doesn't take away from your point, because I completely agree with your point. I guess one question is whether the quality of the data in terms of the input-output tables in many developing countries support this type of work. But I think it's good to look at basically the production process from the point of view from start to finish, within and getting the total labor that's embodied in a product that includes the intermediate goods and goes back in time with the inverse of the Leontief matrix. So I agree completely with you. So I think that's an important area of research. The point is, though, however, I would caution you, I think productivity is really, it's a national issue. And I think it's important that we have national measures of productivity. I don't know what quite an international global productivity chain measure of productivity means. It's interesting. It tells you how much labor across the world is needed to produce a certain output. That's interesting, but it's a lot harder to deal with that in terms of national productivity policies. So I think that's complementary to the overall productivity agenda. It's part of it, but I don't think it's necessarily what a productivity commission would be focusing on.
Okay. Just to follow up on that, because if we become more service-oriented, as we are in the Western world, and more of the capital used is defined as intermediates, it comes to training and business services and so forth. So does it mean that we have to rethink the definition of the capital stock?
Well, I'm not sure of that. Okay, there's all sorts of other problems with the capital stock, like leasing. You know, if a leasing company, what firm, what industry does that belong to? But I'm not so. Services, we're still going to have the capital stock. I don't think that would necessarily be a problem with the capital stock service. Intermediate goods. Could you give an example of what you're referring to?
No, like the OECD is talking about this knowledge-based capital when it comes to data mining, computer services, high-tech services.
Well, that's all fine, but that's not necessarily going to affect the capital stock directly. No. The key thing about capital is really, which I didn't mention, there's two types of capital. There's the tangible capital, which is basically the machines, equipment, structures. And then there's intangible capital, which is things like R&D, which has now been capitalized in the national account. There's reputation, there's patents, and it's much harder to get a handle on that and measures of that. A good example is data. Another association I'm with, the International Association for Research in Income and Wealth, is having a conference in a month on the measurement of data, and should data be included as part of the capital stock. So there's a lot of issues in terms of intangible capital and its contribution to overall productivity growth. I think that's a key issue there.
Oh, yes. Perfect. Let me go to another part here. You talked about this potential trade-offs. What do you think about the when we think about capital, it's often physical capital. I mean, we also have natural capital, and we have social capital, and we have human capital. So my point is that maybe we should be better to include the natural capital in the capital stock to see if we really are more productive or if we are using too much of the natural capital we have.
Well, I agree, and I agree completely. We want to have measures of natural capital, and we can. It's possible to do that. It's basically kind of the flow, the income flow that they would generate. And there's measures in terms of there's a revision of the national accounts going on right now, and there's talk of adding the depreciation or the use of natural capital to the official estimates of the capital stock. So I agree completely. We have to take into account. Now the issue is what's natural capital. Obviously, yes. Is it just oil stocks or copper, or is it include, if you want, the ecosystems?
Yes.
And the sustainability of ecosystems? How do you put a value on that? You can put a value on a stock of oil, but it's much harder to put a value on ecosystems. And of course, this gets into the issue of sustainability. You can argue, well, there's no real sustainability problem with natural resources per se, because prices will work that out, and you can always find new deposits. There is a problem, however, the sustainability of the ecosystem, what we're seeing with climate change, and therefore that can create all sorts of problems down the road. And we'd only have one ecosystem, and it's important that we don't ruin it by let's say, by climate change. That's, I think, a different issue. So that's not a. So I think natural capital is really important. I didn't talk about that, but it's, and as well, social capital, harder to measure, but there are measures of that. And then, of course, human capital, and I talked about that. There's lots of research on measuring human capital. So the capital approach to productivity, I think, is a very fruitful one, and many researchers have taken that.
Okay. Thank you. You also mentioned the work from home revolution, and we have in January we will have Nick Bloom as our guest, as you are today.
Oh, great! Excellent. He's a leading researcher on remote work.
Yeah, he's the guy. But what is your take up until now? Where are you?
Okay. Well, well, I guess I'm in the old-fashioned camp. I find there's a lot of value to being at the office. This is particularly true for young researchers. I employ a lot of young researchers, and I've had some bad experiences where they could never come to the office because they didn't know what was going on. You couldn't talk to them every 2 hours or so. Whereas, so our staff, we literally have 5 days a week people are in, and I don't mind people staying home if they have to finish off a project and they find it noisy at the office or something. But I think interaction, particularly between young workers and older workers, can be very, very valuable for productivity. But overall, I don't think it's a major factor overall. I think the net effect will not be that great. Some people, it helps. Some people, it hurts. I think the major factor, I think, with remote work is the time saving from commuting. Because people do not like to commute, particularly long distances. And if you can save that, their well-being is going to be a lot better. Yeah. So I think so in that sense, I think the movement to remote work, it's really going to be because of improvements in well-being as opposed to improvements in productivity. And I think the movement to remote work is permanent. We're going to see many people working no longer 5 days a week at the office. 2 to 3 is the norm now in Canada. I think that's going to be a permanent change for our society.
Good for you then that you're both working with productivity and economic well-being. So you are well suited to grasp this issue then.
Thank you.
But let's move on to another question, which I find very interesting. And that's the book about Power and Progress by Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, where they argue that there is no automatic mechanism that transfers productivity to real wages. You need technology that is worker friendly, and then you need mechanisms, trade unions and policies to secure the transfer of value from the productivity side to the wage side. Mm-hmm. Do you have any reflection on that book?
Oh, yeah, that's a topic we've done a lot of work on. We had a symposium on that at the International Productivity Monitor on looking at US, UK, Canada about 1.5 years ago. Yeah, we've done a lot of work on that topic. Okay, first off, when we talk about wages, it's actually quite important to distinguish the median wage from the average wage, because within the wage distribution, you can have people at the top doing really well, people at the bottom doing poorer. Yeah. So when we do our work, we're always talking about the median wage, not the average, because the median has in recent years grown at a slower pace than the average because there's been an increased wage inequality. Okay, but you're right. But basically, one would expect over the long run that the median wage would basically track very closely the labor productivity growth rate. But we've seen that in the 80s and in the 90s, it didn't happen. Basically, if you want, the profit share or the share of wages going to the people at the top has been increasing. Now, the bottom line is that's all linked to bargaining power. And what we've seen in Canada, we had very, very large disconnect between median wage growth and productivity in the 80s and 90s, and it decreased a little bit in the 2000s. And then all of a sudden in the 2010, it really decreased significantly, much, much more. Well, what was the key factor driving that? Well, it was basically the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate affects the bargaining power of workers. We had much higher unemployment rates in the 90s, 80s in Canada. The unemployment rate in Canada now has gone down to around 5%. There's talking of labor shortages. Labor shortages are great for workers because they give more bargaining power. So I think it's just a question of bargaining power of workers relative to capital that explains this. And at least now, the bargaining power of labor has improved a lot with full employment. And we're luckily seeing less of a gap between real wages and productivity growth. So I think that's consistent with the book you mentioned by Asbjörn.
Okay. In Sweden, we have this centralized wage mark, which sets the wage increase for the whole country, so to speak, all collective agreements. In that sense, you can secure the wage share of the economy by addressing the arguing that the best productive wage growth is the productivity growth. So,
and have median wages in Sweden track the labor productivity?
Not formally, but when they negotiate, they really close tracking the developments of the productivity growth.
Right, right. Well, if you do that, it's very important to have a good projection of productivity growth. Yes. So if you're projecting productivity growth, people right now are talking about productivity growth going forward in Canada of 0.5%.
Yeah.
So if you do that, does that mean you basically have a real growth rate negotiated 0.5%? Now, we never know what's going to happen to inflation. That's really obviously affects the overall. So it depends whether your wage demands are based in real terms or nominal terms.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I understand. One question on this too. The immigrants issue you mentioned in Canada, we have the same issue in Sweden. We have really improved. The population has grown really fast over the last decade. What are your main productivity takeaways on these waves of immigrants coming?
Well, overall, I'm very positive on immigration for productivity for a variety of reasons. Okay. First off, immigrants often self-select based on their dynamism, their desire to get ahead. So they basically, therefore, many immigrants, when they come to Canada, are very, very keen to get ahead, and they establish businesses, and many of our top businesses have been established by immigrants. So that's a dynamic element for our economy. Also, we select our immigrants based on a point system where we give more points to people that have university degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Half of immigrants to Canada have a university degree compared to about 25% of the overall population. So basically, you give a big boost to your human capital if you're importing all this skilled labor from across the world. That obviously has a positive effect on productivity. And 23% of people in Canada were born outside the country. And we've been able to integrate those people very effectively into our economy. It's changed the nature of Canada. Toronto, more than half the population is a visible minority, which is completely different than it was 60 years ago. And we haven't had any social tension. All political parties, pretty well, at least almost all of them, are in favor of immigration. They're not, even the ones that are against immigration say, oh, we just want to take in 150,000 people a year as opposed to 5,000. So we have some debate about the level of immigration, but even the Conservative Party are not going against the high levels, because employers, of course, like to have like to have immigrants. Now, what I don't like about in Canada, I'm not a big fan of temporary immigration, because then you're bringing in low quality people and you have them for a few years and you kick them out again. I think that's unfair. If you're going to have people come to Canada, they should have a path to become citizens ultimately. Now, in Canada, we don't have a lot of low-skilled workers. Like the United States has a major problem with people coming over the border with Mexico from Latin America, low-skilled. Because Canada is so isolated, we don't have massive numbers of people coming here, low-skilled from Africa or Latin America. We do have control over our borders. So now the issue is whether the issue for immigration in Canada is much more about housing. Medical, we have a housing shortage. The prices of housing in Canada are extremely high. And also many people don't have their own doctor. There's basically queues for medical services. So if you have 500,000 people coming in a year and you're not increasing the number of doctors at the same rate, you're even going to make it worse. So the immigration in Canada is not about their effect on skills or productivity, which I think overall will be positive. It's more of these other social issues.
Okay. In that sense, the Swedish system is more like the US system, with quite a lot of the share of low-skilled coming to Sweden is quite large.
That can, that can of course have a negative compositional effect on productivity, because the jobs they take are low productivity jobs. Hopefully, those people can develop skills over time.
Exactly. That's kind of the discussion we have in Sweden. How to really reskill them to adjust to the Swedish labor market. But finally, we have 2 minutes left, and I have one question I really want to ask you, and I don't see any more questions from the viewers. So I ask that question, and then we'll see if we have a minute left or so. That is the question about Gordon or Brynjolfsson, in the sense, what about the future of productivity? Are we going for a period with slower growth rates or higher growth rates?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I have my strong views. I'm in the Gordon camp.
You're the Gordon camp.
Yeah, basically, we do a lot of work on projecting. We're very interested in potential output, and obviously, to have a potential output measure, you have to have a measure of labor productivity. Now, since Canada has had a productivity growth rate, if you want, since 2000 of about 1%. Since the pandemic, since 2019, it's been 0.3%. It's fallen off. So the big issue in Canada is this a new development, or since 2019, or is it just kind of a cyclical issue associated with the pandemic working its way out? I obviously hope we get back to 1%, but some people argue no, the trend going forward for the next 20 years is going to be 0.5% instead of 1%. Is because of all the effects on the focuses on environmental issues. It's a focus on supposedly a lot of other barriers. It may be right. Obviously, we don't know. I'm more in the 1% camp. I think that in Canada, we'll probably have growth rates of around 1%. That's my number, 1% going forward for the next 20 years. In other words, I don't think AI is all of a sudden going to raise productivity to 1.5 or 2%. I just don't believe that. I just have heard so much hype associated with the technologies. We always had this hype in the past about new technologies. So I'm if you want, I'm basically in the Gordon camp. Still productivity gains. 1% isn't great, but obviously it's better than 0.
Yeah. Perfect. Now we're actually running out of time. Thank you again, Professor Sharp, for sharing your views with us. And we have a seminar coming up next week on the Swedish Productivity Commission, and then we have the Industrial Revolution seminar next week, and then we continue with Nick Bloom and so forth in January. So hopefully you can follow us in one way or the other in the future.
Yeah, I'd like to. That would be great. I enjoyed. That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for today. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Okay, bye.